And now we're back to Plan A. I would like to introduce again Vince Stewart, who will introduce the folks, and Alejandro Espinosa for the legislative panel.
So good morning. I'm Vince Stewart. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Governmental Relations with the Community College Chancellor's Office, and it is my real pleasure this morning to help moderate our legislative panel for you. So I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage, and I will do a quick round of introductions when they get here. And I must let you know that we have a third panelist who's running a little bit behind, so we're going to go ahead and get started and have her join us when she arrives, because I want to be mindful of your agenda and, of course, the time of our panelist. So this morning we are joined by Assemblymember Joan Buchanan. She represents the 16th Assembly District, which includes parts of Alameda and Contra Costa County. She was first elected to the Assembly in 2008 and is currently serving in her final term. She is the chair of the Assembly Education Committee, and prior to being elected to the Assembly, she spent 18 years on the San Ramon Valley School Board. Seated next to Joan is Jeanice Warden. Jeanice Warden is the principal consultant to the Assembly Higher Education Committee, and she is joining us this morning on behalf of the committee and of the chair of the committee, Assemblymember Doss Williams from the Santa Barbara region. And then I'd like to introduce my colleague, Alejandro Espinosa, who is a legislative representative with the Office of Superintendent Tom Torlakson. So what we'd like to do this morning is we shared with the panel a series of questions prior to their presentation this morning. We were going to go through those questions with them and then open it up to the audience for dialogue with you. So with that, I will start, and Alejandro and I will go back and forth on these questions. So the first question we shared with our panel is, from your perspective as a state policymaker involved in the development of the Adult Education Consortium conceptual framework, how would you define success of this initiative? And we'll start with Assemblymember Buchanan.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure being with all of you. I know there are a few friendly faces, people that I know I've met with locally on this issue. I've also always wished I had the artistic talent to do this kind of record keeping, but God gave me other talents. I think when you take a look at adult education and you read the LAO report and you read AB86, what you understand really well, and probably all of you understand better than the two of us up here, is that we have a system that was much more coherent when both community colleges and K-12 were under one governance structure under the State Board of Education. And now that we have our separate governance structures and we've gone decades down the path, we have a system that is not so well defined, that is somewhat fragmented, that delivers different levels of services in different areas. And so the LAO in its report, all of you know very well, basically said you need to have a common vision, decide what you want to do, where you can best deliver those programs, and how you're going to go about affecting change. And the LAO made a number of recommendations. Out of that, as you know, grew a governor's proposal 2 years ago that said we're just going to transfer it all to the community colleges. And a number of people said, wait a minute, that's taking this report too far, and we need to take a step back. So the governor, working with the legislature, said, okay, we're going to require a maintenance of effort and fund the program at the $300 million level for 2 more years. And during that time, we're going to ask the stakeholders from both community colleges and K-12 to engage in a planning process, the consortiums of which you're all part, and to give a report to the legislature. So I'm actually looking forward to receiving that report or reading it next March. But what I look for in success is a very clear definition of what we mean by adult ed. What are those programs, those critical programs that we have to offer, and how do you prioritize those programs? When I meet with people locally in the consortiums, I mean, it's very clear that we would need about 10 times the amount of money that we're committing to adult ed if we're going to do everything. So if we have limited resources, what does the data show in terms of the numbers of individuals we should be serving, and what are those critical programs that we have? And I fully expect that the financial effort that goes to school districts in the state of California may not be the same for every school district because the needs are so different in all those school districts. So what I'm looking at in a report is one that not only addresses what is outlined in AB86, but that's backed up with data and has some priorities, because I fully expect that we're not going to be able to meet all of them. I also would ask that you not be afraid to ask for another year, because I don't know how we're going to have a report that comes to the legislature March 31st, make the changes by the June budget adoption, and then think we're going to have a seamless, coherent implementation. A few months later, and in all the many decades I've spent in public education, one of the greatest mistakes we make is trying to implement things too fast before they're ready, and then we seem to create more of we create a situation where we're potentially contributing to failure more than success, and I think it's critically important that we do it right.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in front of you, and I want to thank you from now on behalf of the Assemblymember Doss Williams, the chair of the Higher Education Committee, for everything that you have been doing, and we look to you as the experts, those that are in the trenches. And I'm honored to be up here with Assemblymember Buchanan, and I would almost imagine that she and my boss, the chair of the committee, have talked, because his sentiments are pretty close to what you have just said. I think one of the ways we could see the success is indeed what's tangible, what can we see? We know we're in tough times, so what are the programs that have the requirements that can continue to go forth? What do the priorities look like, and really what is that definition of adult ed? Also, we agree that don't be shy of asking for another year, and we would even suggest another 2 years, but we think it's important, and you're doing great work in the amount of time you've been given, but we know that you would more than likely need more work to see it continue, to see it, how it can really be measured for success. And quite frankly, that the 2-year mark really may not be enough to fully attribute the successes that are just probably starting to be seen.
Great, thank you. Number 2. Now that we are more than a year into the planning process and there are regional consortia from around the state engaged in development of regional implementation plans to better serve California's adult learners, what would you say are the greatest challenges and opportunities to successfully completing this process? Assemblymember?
Well, I've met with representatives from the regional consortia in both Alameda and Contra Costa County, 2 of the counties that I represent. And, I actually get pretty much the same feedback from them as I probably would if I met with each county that's represented in the room here. And, my basic perception is that we got off to a little bit of a slow start in getting all the consortia up and running. And also going through a process, which you do with any group, in terms of how do we agree on common goals and what we want to do. But the consortia, I believe, feel a little bit like their back is against the wall now in terms of how do we put all of this together in a way that we can write a good, effective report by March 31st and get something to the legislature. So I'm relying on you. As it was mentioned earlier, I spent 18 years on school board, but I will tell you my area of expertise is not adult education. I do have some opinions there. But I hope that we not only get the report, but if you need more time, I want to get it right. I think we've had too many decades now where we've had a program that's hasn't been well defined, that, as I said, has had inconsistencies from district to district. And if we're going to take this opportunity, we need to do all we can to get it right. So, again, I'm just relying on all of you.
And so I would agree that we don't want it to be rushed, and we do want to, I think on behalf of at least the higher education perspective, we would rather have a late report that's thorough and complete versus something that does feel a little bit rushed, that still leaves out some of the T's being crossed, the I's being dotted. And it's such a pivotal time, and in my experience and just the background that I know of what's been going on with adult education for the last several years, this is really the first time when, because of AB 86, everyone in the room is actually together at the same time discussing this pivotal issue and this critical issue. And we are at a pivotal point in that transition, so I think it will be good the success will be really, I think, proven in part based on what we see in the report, which is why normally we like reports on time, and I'm not advocating on behalf of everyone, oh, make it late, but that would be part of your success. I mean, that we look at those reports and that we would be able to see where you are, but when it's kind of fragmented potentially, we wouldn't be able to know everything that you all are doing. So being in the room together, K-12 side and community college side, I think is important, and then continuing to keep those lines of communication open with or without what happened, whether or not the extension happens and more money happens, I think it's still important, and then we can see that success when we know the communication is continuing.
So I'm going to pause just for one quick minute so I can introduce Kathleen Chavira, who is a principal consultant with the Senate Education Committee, and Kathleen is here on behalf of the committee as well as the chair of the committee, Senator Carol Liu, who represents the Pasadena area. So we're fortunate to have her join us this morning. And if I can maybe put her on the spot, I might return back to the first question and just see if we can get a few brief thoughts from her about that. And that question was, Kathleen, from your perspective as a state policymaker involved in the development of the Adult Education Consortium Program Conceptual Framework, that's a mouthful, how would you define success for this initiative?
Okay. I think I'll focus on two elements that I think were objectives of the legislature and certainly of Senator Liu when we entered into the conversations around AB 86 as well as SB 173. And I think the first element of success is a program of serving adult learners in California that really acknowledges that there are advantages and skills and competencies that are brought by both large providers of adult ed. And there's a reason to have a role for K-12 providers and for community college providers. I don't think that success is viewed as the elimination of either of those. It's really a recognition that depending upon the needs at the local level and in a locally determined process, the most appropriate providers meeting the needs of those local districts would emerge, and that it would be a consensus process that best serves those communities. So I think that's the first element. I think the second measure of success is that the idea of this regional structure was to try to get a focus on really meeting the needs that exist. So in my mind, success is expanding what has up to now been able to be offered to adult ed learners so that regions of the state in which there may have been a variety of efforts but they weren't coordinated, perhaps weren't as efficient, and perhaps there was some confusion, that bringing folks together results in a better end product that serves more people more effectively. And I think those are to me would be the two measures of success, and are really the objectives of the folks who've been working on this.
And then Kathleen, the second question that we were asking as you joined us is that now that we're more than a year in the planning process and there are regional consortia from around the state engaged in development of regional implementation plans to better serve California's adult learners, what would you say are the greatest challenges and opportunities to successfully completing this process?
Well, I think it's a challenge and it is an opportunity for folks at the local level. I know this is a difficult message, but I hear the angst and I hear the concern about the continuation of positions and funding. And I get that. I understand that. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be there. I mean, there's clearly some really important conversations to be had. But I think that the challenge and the opportunity is that if you focus on what it is that we're asking you to do through these statutes and through the budget language, that the challenge is to come together and really come up with reasonable, well thought out solutions. And the opportunity is to demonstrate that you can do that and that it warrants the investment of the state in a program that has addressed the kinds of issues that were raised in the report that went out from the LAO a few years ago about inconsistencies and duplication. I think that's it's a challenge because I understand that all of those potential obstacles for you at the local level in terms of, do we have a job and who's getting this and who's managing the money, those are real, but if you can get past those to really focus on doing the work, then that's the opportunity, because I think that'll speak for itself, and it's a really important piece of making the other argument. So,
No, that's actually a really terrific segue into the next question, which is, speaking of the uncertainty and the angst over the planning process and how it will play out, I mean, what would you say to folks in the field who have concerns over an uncertain future? And I'll start with Assemblymember Buchanan.
Well, I would say we're going to have adult education in this state. And one of the great things about public education in the United States is we don't give up on people. You know, if someone faces adversity and they don't graduate from high school, we don't say, okay, that's it, you're done. We give them opportunities to go back and get their GED and go to college and become successful, productive citizens. So I think we're going to have adult education. But I think the LAO did bring up some very valid issues. And so in leading back to the last question, I think this is our opportunity to redefine adult education given the changing population that we have in this state. We all know that the K-12 population has changed dramatically. We know that California's population is changing. We are implementing some of the biggest changes in K-12 in over half a century between Common Core, Smarter Balance, local control funding formulas, the local control accountability plans. I mean, those are the biggest changes we've implemented, at least in my lifetime here in the state. And at the higher ed level, we're certainly asking people to do more with less. I know locally I've seen greater cooperation between the education communities and the workforce investment boards and the job corps and the businesses and others in terms of helping people re-enter the career and be ready for well-paid jobs than I have in the past. So I think we need to seize this moment, and all of you are the experts. We're not the experts. We need to seize this moment, and we need to take a look. What does the data show? You know, how many people are English language learners that fall into the adult category that we need to provide programs to so they get the language acquisition to help their students to go out and get jobs and to become productive members of our societies? How many students and what's the trend in terms of they don't finish their high school diploma on time and they need to get the GED? Let's take a look at the data and take a look at what our opportunities are and redefine adult education in a way that we can move forward over the next decade or two and move this state forward and give everyone opportunity.
Jeanice, same question?
And just to echo a little bit, I think you can see that some of us here, we're on the same page, and we aren't the experts, and we are looking to you all. And so even though there is that angst and that uncertainty, and I've gotten numerous calls and emails from even some of you in the room that I'm recognizing some of your faces in different meetings, we feel that angst for you. We know that there is that uncertainty, but I think at the same time, as echoing what Kathleen said, if there's a way to spin some of that uncertainty into just pushing even harder to continue to work with your expert minds into solutions that can captivate and capture the moment that is right now to be able to redefine adult ed, that might hopefully give you a warm fuzzy knowing that there are people in Sacramento that are, advocating for the same things, but needing your help to show us how best it looks. And I think also knowing that you're not alone and continuing to work collaboratively hopefully can help with that rub and that angst of the uncertainty of what happens.
Okay, and I think that what I would add to this is that for those who are concerned about an uncertain future, is what was certain was that all of this was put into place because of a commitment to meet the needs of a population that matters in California. I think there was growing concern about making sure that services that were critical to California's economic future were being delivered. As Assemblymember Buchanan said, there's a changing demographic in California. The data that we've seen shows that the proportion of people in poverty without a high school diploma in need of ESL services is huge, especially within certain counties across the state. So there is definitely opportunity there. They're telling us it's over 5 million people who aren't currently being served. So the certainty is that if we have a structure and programs that are able to document what it is that we need and to show that there are efforts being exerted and good programs being developed and accountability being met for the dollars that the state is putting into this, there's a commitment to doing something about this. That's what created this whole process, was that commitment. So that's what I would suggest to you about anyone who feels uncertain, is that we are certain that there's something missing here. So the opportunity is to tell us how you're feeling what's missing for us, how you're making sure that at the local level that we're taking care of the needs of the state ongoing.
Great, thank you. Number 4, where do you think the balance lies between the needs and priorities of the state and the needs and priorities of local communities? And again, Assemblymember Buchanan.
Boy, that's a really tough question, because California is a big state. We have 39 million people, and there's no doubt that if you go from county to county or district to district, we don't all serve exactly the same populations. And so it's critically important, whether you're looking at just strict K-12 education, whether you're looking at community college, whether you're looking at adult programs, that we be able to give locals the ability to tailor those programs to meet the needs of their unique populations. And I've always believed that one of the things we want to do at the state is sort of create that umbrella, create broad policies for you, and then allow you the freedom within that to design programs that meet your needs. Now, the other big issue with California education that all of you know is that it's essentially funded by the state of California. So in many respects, local control is great, but if you don't get the funding from Sacramento, you can't do that all that you know is right for children and adults and education. And when you look at a state right now that, by the latest report, and we may have gone up a little bit because of Prop 30, is 50th in the nation in per pupil funding for K-12, and also underfunds all 3 levels of higher education, there's no doubt that puts a huge constraint on our ability to fund programs and oftentimes, fund them at a level that allows you to provide the programs and services that we all know is right. And so there's, I think, going to be, continually be that sort of tension between Sacramento and the locals in terms of how do we take these limited resources and allocate them in the most cost-effective way possible to get the results we want. And I'm not naive. I was on a panel with Silicon Valley Leadership Group a few weeks ago, and one of the questions was, well, why aren't we funding this program? And one of the respondents said, well, your school board has to just make it a priority. And well, I was on local school board, and you can make it a priority all you want, but if there's no money in the bank account and you can't write the check, you can't fund the program. So I will also say long term, we've got to find a better way to fund education in the state if we're going to continue.
Thank you. Jeanice?
And again, there is something to be said about local control. I know Assemblymember Williams is definitely an advocate of local control, knowing that each region is going to have a different need versus another region. His region in Santa Barbara has a vast difference in what you might find in Humboldt County or in Los Angeles, LAUSD, or LA Community College District. So there is something definitely to be said about local control. Again, you all are the experts, and we definitely appreciate that. And as Assemblymember Buchanan said, and Assemblymember Williams would echo the same sentiments, because most of the funding or all of the funding is coming from Sacramento, there is that need for that accountability piece. And so there has to be a continued marriage, for lack of a better word, of that local control being local, but knowing that there is that oversight from the state and wanting to see that accountability, wanting to look at the data that you all are trying to work hard to provide so that, for lack of a better word, you're proving your worth. I hate to say that, but in this time, even though the economy is bouncing back, and quite frankly, I agree, we have not funded education as we need to, K-12 or higher ed, at the end of the day, it's still almost like there is a competition that still takes place. And so sadly to say, there is a need to continue to, prove the worth. And in the Capitol, you tend to see that in the data and the different reports and whatnot. And so there is that marriage, and we need to be able to know that as you all are working at what you do best in the local elements, in the local trenches, that we are looking and we want to be able to be part of the process to help make sure that you all are successful, because that's making sure that our state is successful.
Thank you. Kathleen?
Well, I would say there's not much new that I can add to what's already been said. I think, it's all the same theme. The only additional thought I would add is that at the state level, I think that the balance here requires that we be clear about what our expectations are at the state level for the funding that's being provided, and how it is that we're going to measure whether or not you're meeting our expectations. And I think I would just challenge folks to rethink what it means to talk about control at the local level, because I think it's difficult in a region to think about local control and 3 different boards of 3 different entities spread out serving different populations. Everybody has a very different idea of what local control means. It means my board, right? So I would say that I would challenge people to rethink local control as not being about your community college board or your school district governing board or your workforce investment board, but really being about thinking at a regional level about what the needs of that region is and what the role that each of those entities plays, and that's the local control that you want to communicate up to the state. That's all I'd say.
Great, thank you. So I think with the first 4 questions, you've really provided some terrific insights in terms of what the regional consortia and the folks at the local level might want to think about, not to suggest that they haven't been spending a lot of time thinking about these issues. But turning your thoughts a moment to the folks in Sacramento, we're curious, what advice would you have to the Chancellor's Office, to the Department of Education, and to your colleagues in the legislature about moving forward from here and how we might reach that definition of success that you spoke to earlier on? And I'll start with Assemblymember Buchanan.
It's nothing like being left to the speaker. I'm going to say this with utmost respect for my colleagues in the legislature, but, everyone wants to be an education legislator, because if you take any poll in California, education polls as a very high priority. One of the reasons the Prop 30 funds are pretty much dedicated to education is because the voters support education. We had hoped to get a school bond on the ballot, and that polled at well over 60% in a couple different polls. I mean, people in California value their entire system of public education and understand that it's the real driver of our economy. And but at the same time, while your education, while all the legislators, I believe, value education, many haven't really set foot in a classroom for a decade, 2 decades, or longer. And so this is going to be a huge policy discussion in the legislature. And I don't see the discussion being around, should we have adult education? I think the discussion is going to be around, how do we write implementing legislation for AB86? And my advice would be that we have some joint hearings with the Senate Ed, with Assembly Higher Ed and K-12, and invite key stakeholders in, not only to present the report, but to be able to ask questions, so that those people who are serving on the policy committees, because this isn't just a budget issue, it's a policy issue, and maybe we invite the budget committees, but that we have some hearings so that people really can have a deep understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish, what the numbers show, what the objectives are, and that members have that opportunity to ask any questions they have of you, so that, and that we then are able, at least with the leadership of the committees, continue the dialogue, so that we take all the good work that you're doing and we put it into legislation that really follows that work and results in a new adult ed program that works. And so that would be my advice to the legislature.
Jeanice?
And I think, as well as some of you in the room, you have been making the rounds trying to meet individually with different staff at the Capitol, different legislative aides, district directors of your particular regions, the members that represent your regions. And I think that's also something that's important because, as Assemblymember Buchanan said, education tends to be a soundbite. Sadly, because we know there's so many issues that encompass education that a lot of members that are running for the Assembly or the Senate, they want to become education policy people. And I don't know if they necessarily understand everything that it entails, but I think even with you all taking the time to meet with them locally or in Sacramento when you have different visits up here, that also helps because they need to be educated about education, if you will, if you follow. And I think that's something that will continue to help. I love the idea of continuing to have joint hearings with the different policy committees, incorporating the budget committees. I know in January, we convened a rather large oversight hearing. It was the Senate Education Committee and the Assembly Higher Education Committee, and we really were able to get some good information and feedback from some of the members, some of you in the room. I'm going to call out Dr. Schultz over there and others that were part of the panel and answering questions and helping us to understand what everything means from your expertise. So I think that's going to be a critical component of just educating the members as to what it involves. And I think one thing is having members now that will be able to be in the Assembly and in the Senate for more than 6 or 8 years, I think will be helpful because it will give them more time to fully grasp and understand what they're dealing with. 6 years is so short. Like, it's sad that Assemblymember Buchanan is termed out when I think personally, she's continuing to hit her stride. She's championed education as the chair of the committee, and now she's gone because of term limits. And so having members there longer, this will give you opportunities to develop rapport with them and to really be able to have them look to you also as experts in helping to understand how the process works, as well as even from staff, because again, so many of you in the room I know I've had conversations with that have been eye-opening, that have been helpful for me as I continue to learn. I think from the perspective with Department of Education and the Chancellor's Office, continuing to keep us in the loop as to the great work that's being done. I know there's that wonderful tool online with the AB86 work group and the cabinet and what you all are doing, and you can subscribe and get from the listserv and get updates as to what's been going on this past year, and that's helpful. But I think sometimes too, just not even as maybe a big a venue as this, just continuing to know that we want to be of as much help as we can. And something that I'm excited for is even many of you in the room will probably be meeting with at least Kathleen and I tomorrow afternoon, as well as representatives of the Department of Ed and the Chancellor's Office, so that even in a more intimate setting, we'll have a chance to dialogue with you and pick your brains more as to what's been working. And I think having those opportunities periodically to just check in and stay engaged is something that will be very helpful, because it is a partnership, and it's going to take continued work, and that's what we have to do. And so I know, at least from the perspective of my current chair and myself and our committee, we are committed to being there to be able to partner with you so that this can be successful and we can really make adult ed what it needs to be, and it can continue to thrive and grow as an established entity.
So I'll start with my advice to the field. And I think that what I would say is that you need to remember to focus forward. A lot of the dialogue that we hear is about maintaining the status quo or undoing something, or that we didn't understand how it impacted. The truth is that the structure is what it is now, and if you focus forward, and that's not to say that the issues that are being raised when you look back aren't real, but you want to talk about them with a focus looking forward. There's a new paradigm, and I think it's really important to send the message that you're willing to try to make this new paradigm work, and that you want to own it, and you want to improve it, and hear the suggestions for how that works. It's a very different way of communicating than what I've seen over the last 2 years, and I know that comes from a place of uncertainty and fear, and I totally understand that. But I do think that the end result, if you're coming from a place of focusing forward, will be much better for everyone. I think to the CDE and Chancellor's Office, as well as to the regional consortia, the advice is to keep communicating with us. Keep identifying the challenges that you're hitting, because again, the intent with the change that was made was to make things better. It was to improve. So if that's not happening and if there's an obstacle, you have an audience of people who want to understand that, want to know what your thoughts are about how to make that better, and have the ability to do something about it. So keeping those healthy communication channels open are really important. And then finally, in the communication to colleagues in the legislature, it's what Jeanice just talked about. The joint informational hearing that we held back in January was informative for our members. In fact, I would say that was maybe the quietest hearing I've ever heard, because members were actually listening. They weren't there to talk. They were hearing what the field was saying. They were hearing what the consortia groups were saying. So the advice I give to legislative colleagues is we need to create the forums for communication to occur. And yes, that's coming to our offices, but I think it is things like informational hearings, like the meetings that the consortia cabinet have set up for some of you with some of the key staff in the building. So, and I think, again, I would just echo again that there is a commitment to this. I don't think people anywhere are trying to skirt any of these issues. This was entered into with the intent that we want to improve things and we want to expand what's available. So people are going to be open to hearing what that looks like.
Great, thank you. So that concludes the prepared questions that we have, but with the time remaining, we really want to open it up to you. I believe there's some microphones that are around the room, so if you want to raise your hand, we'll get the microphone to you, and you're certainly welcome to ask a question to the panel. We've got one over here. And if you could identify yourself, please.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Marvin Martinez. I'm the president of East LA College. And I serve as one of the co-chairs of the LA Adult Ed Consortia, along with my colleague who's also sitting with us, Donna Brashear, who's the executive director of the LA Unified School District Adult Ed program. My question really has to do with consortias. No doubt in the bill, consortias are a key here. Thus far, they have served as that forum and that mechanism to bring these large entities together that have never really met to discuss these kind of issues before. So it has served a really important purpose. My question is, what's the next chapter for the consortias? What do you see them doing? We're hearing things about the possibility of adult ed funds flowing through the consortias. We're hearing many things. So I do want to hear from you as to what you see as the next chapter and what the role the consortiums will need to start taking. My second question is that if you see a much more significant role, how do you see us playing and mitigating that role with our school boards and trustees? And because they obviously play the significant role of being the policy makers and so forth. So those are my two questions.
So maybe this time we'll start with Kathleen, and we'll work from the opposite side of the table. I don't want to get in trouble with the assembly members. So.
Okay. Well, I would say to you, I have been hearing these issues starting to emerge, and I don't have the answer. Yeah, I think that, again, I'm looking to hear from folks at the local level about solutions and answers to those questions. It is conceivable, I think, that a consortia could function as a mechanism for distributing funding. And perhaps that is the best way to go about this, because you don't have the issue of conflicting boards managing funds. I think most of you probably know that there are some folks who have been shopping around a concept that money should flow from the state agencies. And maybe that makes sense. I get that there are issues around matching funds with federal dollars. Where does that data exist? I think that my advice to the consortia would be, this is an opportunity for you to really shape that discussion, because I don't think we want to dictate from the state level down that it has to be a certain way. That was actually why we had this very nebulous description of consortia, because the state shouldn't be in the business of telling you who at the local level should be at the table to address the issues at the local level. It was the idea that you would come together and you would form, and it would be somewhat organic, and maybe out of that a structure would emerge. There are existing regional structures. We anticipated that some of those would be what would come into play, but we really wanted to let folks at the local level tell us how this was going to work. We're still in that mode. So I apologize in that I'm probably not answering the question directly. But I would say that all of that is possible, and we look to you to guide us.
And I guess just a little bit to add to that would be going back to what Kathleen said a few minutes ago, helping to change the mindset of what exactly local means. So I think this is a really good time from the consortia standpoint that we've also heard that there might be some rub that's happening with some of the local boards and whatnot. But I think by being a part of the consortia and maybe helping to educate the members of the boards as to what we think local could mean, including your expertise as the consortia, might also help with that. But again, it was left vague purposely because we're looking to you all to help us, help you to make it come together.
I'm going to give a little bit different answer. I've viewed the consortia as being created specifically for planning purposes. Doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't or shouldn't continue, but we wanted a planning consortia in each region that either followed the counties or other types of boundaries. And I, again, am hoping that we get a report, whether an interim report in March, a final one or whatever. Certainly, I'm sure everyone would love to have the final report. I'm looking for one that addresses the objectives in AB86, but also is supported by data. One of the things we tend to do in government is create another level of bureaucracy every time we have a problem or an issue. And if you take a look at, we have a K-12 governance structure, we have a community college governance structure. Within K-12s, we have SELPAs that deal with special education. But even within the SELPAs, you have local school districts that do much of the hiring, but not all of the hiring. I'm not convinced yet, I'm not saying I couldn't be convinced, that we should create a governance structure where the consortia becomes the governance structure. I think that, the more you're able to get money directly to the entities that are providing the programs, the more people that you're able to serve. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't come to us with that recommendation if that is what your recommendation is. But I think ultimately, in a very simplistic point of view, I think the LAO report said, what should the adult education look like going forward? Who can best deliver those programs and services? And I would suggest that there are some where absolutely the K-12 is going to be the best provider. There are others where they should fall within the community college realm, and there are others that should fall to workforce investment boards and others. So I'm looking to you to be able to define that and to be able to do it in an objective way that we can create then a funding mechanism to fund those specific programs and the entities that are best to provide them. Now, maybe a consortia works like a SELPA, maybe it doesn't. I would hope that whether we continue with the consortia or not, though, that these relationships that you've built within your consortia will continue so that you can take a look at what's happening locally, share best practices, and continually work on improving programs to meet the needs of the people you're serving.
Great. Other questions? We got one right here in front.
Good morning. My name is Russell Castañeda Calleros. I serve as the Director of Government and Community Relations at Rio Hondo College, and I'm here with the Rio Hondo Region Adult Education Consortium. And my question has to do with the budget and planning ahead. I would like to know what kinds of opportunities you have as legislators and as staff and consultants to influence the governor's budget process leading up to the governor's budget in January. And the reason why I ask this question is because we were counseled as consortia to start putting budget estimates of all of our programmatic needs in objectives 3, 5, 6, and 7, which we have to include in this October 31st version of the report that you're going to get in March, and that these budget estimates were going to start becoming the foundational building blocks of whatever ask we're going to be giving to you in March. And I understand March might be too late to influence the governor's budget. So I just would like to educate us more about the ongoing dialogue you have with the governor's office to help shape that budget in terms of how we can help adult education for next year? Thank you.
I don't know who really influences this governor. Even on his own staff. I mean, he definitely, he's very smart. He's an independent thinker and very hard to predict. The reason I think you need to set out priorities is because you're not going to get all the money you need. Like I said, in meeting with the consortia and the counties I represent, the ask would be about 10 times more than we're funding now, and I don't know what the governor's going to propose, but I would probably, if I were going to guess, I would guess he's probably going to propose a level of funding similar to what's been in the budget. And there's not any entity in education that I believe that we adequately fund, and that's why you need to have those priorities. I will say, though, that the governor will come out with a budget in January, and we will all anxiously await it and read it, and staffs are going to be going over it with a fine-tooth comb as soon as it comes out to be able to brief their members on it within hours. But that's not the final budget. I mean, negotiations go on between January and June 15th when we vote on the budget. And so I'm sure the budget will evolve. I'm sure there will be thought and input that goes into the budget with respect to adult ed after the report comes out. But there is going to be that struggle, that tension between, how do I continue to move K-12 towards their targeted base grants, right? Because on an adjusted inflation basis, we're still below the 2007-2008 funding level. How do I provide the funding I need for higher ed so that, you can, so community college level, the state college, UC level, you can increase enrollment and meet the needs of students? And I tell people the irony today is if we, at K-12, we graduated every student college and career ready, there's no room for them at the end when they move on. And how do I also fund programs like adult education? So there is going to be that tension, and I don't think you're going to get all the funding you need. And that's why your report needs to be, I think, needs to include priorities in terms of these are the directives you gave us in AB86. These are what we think are the most important priorities. These are the numbers of people that we have to serve in these areas. This is what the cost is. This is the entity that is, we believe, is best equipped to meet those needs. And I think you need to lay all of that out. Because I know whether it goes back to my working in the private sector or when I was on school board, oftentimes you can do 10 things kind of so-so, or you can do 1 or 2 things really well. Those are the decisions that you've got to be thinking about when you write your report and send it to the legislature.
And I think just to add to that in terms of the process, it's never too early to start trying to make a connection with someone. I don't necessarily think you have to start immediately in the governor's office, but maybe as a collective body and maybe something you all discuss as a whole while you're here is who could be that spokesperson or what number of you representing a variety of the consortia come together and, meet with the Department of Finance, because they are starting to talk about different things from now. And I think as well as keeping the members and staff, keeping us in the loop as to where you are, because if we have an understanding as to what you might be asking for, and as Assemblymember Buchanan said, you hope for the best, but you expect the worst, and we know even in the best of best situations, you're not going to get all the funding you need. But if we at least have an understanding as with the money that you're asking for, what are your priorities, that helps us when we have various meetings between now and January and June 15 with different members of the Department of Finance and with the governor's office. And I will say, for those of you that are joining us in our meeting tomorrow afternoon, I understand there will be some staff from the Department of Finance as well. So that might be another question you raise then if you're in the room.
And not much more to add here. I would echo Assemblymember Buchanan's comment about this governor knows what he wants to do. So, but that said, I think it is very important to have the conversations and the communication. You do have folks that represent you that have been meeting with us and talking about that March 15th date and how critical that is particularly for some of the K-12 providers, with the MOE going away. It's obviously a concern, so we're hearing it. I think there's concern about it. I think finance understands it. Not sure what the solution is, but it's really important to keep having that dialogue in the fall so that it influences what comes out in January in some way, and even if it doesn't, so nobody can say, well, you didn't say anything, right? So you need to get that message in front of people. And then I would say, again, that you have a budget that will come out in January. You have a May revise, which reflects real numbers, and you have negotiations from two houses and the Department of Finance, and you have the information coming from the Department of Ed and the Chancellor's Office. So it's a very living process, so it's not over until it's over. So.
Great. So I know that we're standing between you and lunch, but I think there's probably time for one final question. I think we've got one right down here near the front. We'll get a mic to you.
I think I've got a clear path.
Hi, I'm Wendy Miller. I'm the project lead for the AB86 effort in San Francisco. And what has come up in every public convening and every focus group and every interview for us is we already deliver all of these services instructionally, but the only way to make them successful and make those students successful is with a whole lot of student support services which are left out of this legislation. And this is an extremely vulnerable group of people who need a lot of help to navigate community college, adult ed, however it is. And I'm just curious as to, is there any way to expand the definition of what constitutes adult ed services to include counseling and wraparound services?
Well, first of all, let me say that you're lucky that you're able to provide all these services, because there are districts in this state who have very meager adult programs and aren't able to do that. So I think that, and I congratulate you on the job you're doing there. I don't think there's anything wrong with putting into the report that for these services to be most effective, we also need to have some support services that help contribute to the success of those enrolled in the program. I have to, I'll go back, I've said the same thing, I'm going to sound like the broken record here. My guess is the report's going to say, okay, if we're going to meet all the objectives of AB86, this is how much money we need, and how much money you need is going to be many, many times more than what the current program is. And it's, if you think about it, if it's 10 times more, which is what I'm hearing locally, and you've got $300 million committed, that's taking the program and making it a $3 billion program. It's not likely to happen. So I'm skeptical as to whether or not you would get broad support for adding that on top, particularly when there's some districts that are having trouble even providing some of the basic programs. But I don't think it's unrealistic at all to put that in the report, because you can't do what you don't know or what you don't understand. And I would rather have someone come to me and say, this is what I need, and then have to make that decision, than have someone 5 or 10 years later say, well, this is important, but we didn't put it in for these reasons. So give everybody all the information you can, and then let them make the best decisions they can, balancing all the different priorities of both adult ed and K-12 and higher ed.
And I think just to add to that, at least from the community college side of things, I know they've been doing great work with student support services and with legislation that's not directly tied to adult education on making sure that there's more student support services put into place. And so there could be room in that conversation to explore how do you open up that definition so that maybe it trickles down for the adult ed side of it as well. But I agree with Assemblymember Buchanan, at least itemizing that in the report so we know it's helpful. It's one of those, questions that I don't think we have a full answer to, but I think there are enough people that would agree with you that you do need to see that support as well.
And just a quick echo of the community college side, we put a lot of money in this year's budget into matriculation funds, which are intended to provide the kinds of services that you're talking about for all students, including the adult ed non-credit students. And so in a report that talks about the needs for this type of thing, I think it would really be important to address how the existing resources are being used and what the challenges are for those resources being able to meet some of these needs. My intuition, because it's not what my strongest policy knowledge centers around, is that there are similar kinds of supports and services through the Workforce Investment Act, as well as through federal funds that come to local providers to be able to deliver some of the career education that folks are looking for. So I don't think it's an unreasonable issue to raise, but I do think it's important to account for the fact that there are some funds, and if those do fall short, why are they falling short? That's it.
Great. Well, I think that will wrap it up. Please join me in thanking our panelists. They've done a terrific job. And I'll turn it over to Giselle.
Great job.
Thank you. So we are going to break for lunch. A few logistics around that and a few housekeeping